It's late afternoon somewhere in northern Europe, and a woman is standing in her doorway watching the shadows. She doesn't know what time it is, not in the way you might check a phone or glance at a watch, but she knows with a certainty that feels almost physical that she has perhaps 2 hours of workable light remaining, maybe less. Her body knows this. Her eyes know this. The angle of the sun against the side of the barn, the length of the shadow it casts across the dirt yard, the quality of the light itself, these things speak to her in a language she learned so early she can't remember not knowing it. This is not unusual. This is not remarkable. Every person in her village reads the day this way. Every person she has ever known, every ancestor stretching back further than anyone can remember, has lived inside this same kind of knowing. Time, before we built machines to measure it, was not abstract. It was not a number. It was the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, the body, the land. It was everything happening around you and inside you all at once, and you learned to read it the way you learned to read faces, or weather, or danger. The woman in the doorway is not thinking about any of this, of course. She's thinking about whether she has enough time to finish mending the fence before dark, whether her daughter will be back from the stream before the air gets cold, whether the bread rising near the fire will be ready when her husband returns from the fields. She's thinking in terms of tasks and rhythms, not hours and minutes. She doesn't know that thousands of years from now, people will find it almost impossible to imagine living this way. She doesn't know that time will become something you can hold in your hand, something that beeps and glows and tells you exactly how many minutes remain until your next obligation. She doesn't know that humans will eventually become so separated from the sun's movement that they'll need to be reminded to go outside, to notice the sky, to feel the day passing. She just knows that the light is fading, and there's work to do, and her body has been keeping time since she was born. This is where we're beginning. Not with the invention of clocks, but with the long, slow millennia before them. With the world as it was when time was something you felt rather than something you checked. When knowing what part of the day you were in was as natural as knowing whether you were hungry or tired or cold. We're going to move slowly through this world. We're going to notice things. We're going to watch how people oriented themselves in time when time had no numbers attached to it, when a day was not 24 identical hours but a living thing that changed with the seasons, when noon in summer felt completely different from noon in winter. And that difference mattered. There's no rush here. We have all the time we need. Or rather, we're going to spend the next long while thinking about how humans spent most of their existence without the ability to measure time precisely, and how they managed perfectly well anyway. The sun is setting on that village. The woman has gone back inside. Her husband is walking back from the fields in the dimming light, following a path he knows so well he could walk it in full darkness. Their daughter is climbing the hill from the stream, hurrying a little now, because the shadows are long and the air is cooling, and she knows without being told that this is the part of the day when you move toward home and fire and food. None of them know what time it is. All of them know exactly where they are in the day. Let's start with the sun, because that's where almost everyone started. The sun does this thing that's so obvious we barely think about it. It moves across the sky in a predictable arc, every single day, rising in one direction and setting in the opposite direction, and the height of that arc changes gradually over the course of a year. If you're alive and you have eyes and you spend your days outside, which describes almost every human who lived before quite recently, you notice this. You can't help but notice it. The sun wakes you up. The sun warms you. The sun makes your crops grow or wither. The sun tells you when you can work and when you can't. And so, thousands and thousands of years ago, long before anyone thought to write anything down, humans were already dividing their days by the sun's position. Not with precision, not with numbers, but with a kind of practical poetry. Morning was when the sun was low in the east and rising. Midday was when it was high overhead and your shadow was short. Afternoon was when it had passed its peak and was descending. Evening was when it was low in the west and the air was cooling. Night was when it was gone. These weren't exact measurements. They didn't need to be. If you were a farmer, you needed to know that you should probably start heading in from the far field when the sun was about there in the sky, because otherwise you'd be walking home in darkness, and that was less pleasant and more dangerous. If you were tending animals, you needed to know that they should be brought in when the light looked like this, felt like this. The human eye is remarkably good at judging the sun's position. If you spend enough time outside, you develop an almost unconscious sense of where the sun should be at any given point in the day. You can estimate, without thinking about it, how much daylight remains. This was universal. Every culture, everywhere, was doing this in some form. In ancient Egypt, they eventually divided daylight into 12 parts and night into 12 parts, which gave them a 24-part day. Though the parts weren't equal. A daylight hour in summer was longer than a daylight hour in winter because there was simply more daylight to divide. They called these seasonal hours or temporal hours, and they made perfect sense if you thought about time as something that existed in relation to the sun rather than as an abstract, unchanging measurement. The Romans did the same thing. The Greeks did the same thing. Cultures across Asia and Africa and the Americas did versions of the same thing. Daylight was divided into segments, and those segments expanded and contracted with the seasons. This feels strange to us now. We're used to an hour being exactly 60 minutes, no matter what. We're used to time being constant, mechanical, divorced from nature. But for most of human history, time was flexible. It breathed with the seasons. An hour of daylight in June was a different creature than an hour of daylight in December, and everyone understood this because everyone could see it happening. There was something else the sun did that people noticed very early. It created shadows, and those shadows moved in predictable ways. Stick a pole in the ground, or a stone, or anything vertical, and watch its shadow over the course of a day. In the northern hemisphere, the shadow starts long, pointing west in the morning. It gets shorter as the sun rises, reaching its shortest point at midday when the sun is directly south. Then it lengthens again as the sun descends, pointing east by evening. This happens every day. It never fails. The shadow is a sundial, whether you think of it that way or not. And people did think of it that way, very early. We have evidence of shadow clocks from ancient Egypt going back to at least 1,500 BCE, probably earlier. These weren't sophisticated instruments. They were often just a flat piece of wood or stone with marks on it, and a raised piece that cast a shadow. You'd orient the thing properly in the morning, and the shadow would move across the marks as the day progressed, giving you a rough sense of which part of the day you were in. But the principle is much older than any artifact we've found. The idea that you can track time by watching shadows is so intuitive, so obvious once you start paying attention to shadows at all, that humans almost certainly figured this out thousands of years before they thought to make dedicated tools for it. Imagine you're sitting outside your home in the morning, very long ago. You're waiting for something, maybe for someone to arrive, maybe for enough time to pass before you need to start a certain task. There's a rock near you, or a tree, and you notice its shadow. You notice, without quite thinking about it, that the shadow is in a certain position. Time passes. You look again. The shadow has moved. You're not stupid. You're not unobservant. You see the connection. The shadow's position tells you something about how much time has passed. Do this enough days and you start to recognize patterns. You start to notice that when the shadow is here, it's about the right time to do this thing. When it's there, it's time for that. You don't need to invent anything. You don't need to build anything. The sun and any object that blocks it have created a clock for you. You just need to pay attention. And people did pay attention. For thousands of years, shadows were one of the primary ways humans oriented themselves in time during daylight hours. Later, much later, these shadow observations became more formalized. The ancient Greeks and Romans built elaborate sundials, beautiful things with carefully calculated angles and marks for different hours. In the Islamic world, scholars created incredibly precise sundials that could account for latitude and the equation of time. In medieval Europe, cathedrals had sundials carved into their walls, but all of that sophistication grew from something much simpler. Someone, sometime deep in the past, watching a shadow move and understanding what it meant. The night sky was different but equally reliable. When the sun set, it took the most obvious timekeeper with it, but it revealed others. The stars wheel across the sky in patterns so regular that once you learn them, you can read them like a map, like a calendar, like a clock all at once. Different constellations are visible at different times of year. The stars rise and set at predictable times. If you know the stars, you know what season you're in. You know what part of the night you're in. The moon is even more obvious. It waxes and crests and wanes in a cycle that takes about 29.5 days. And this cycle never stops, never varies more than slightly. You can count days by the moon. You can know, by looking at the moon's phase, roughly where you are in the month. Many early cultures organized their calendars around the moon. A month was a moon, literally the time from one new moon to the next. 12 of these lunar months got you close to a solar year. Not perfectly, but close enough that you could track the seasons reasonably well if you paid attention and made adjustments. But for telling time within a single night, the stars were more useful than the moon. If you were a shepherd, which many people were, spending nights out in the fields watching over animals, you learned the stars the way you learned your own village. You learned which stars rose at which times. You learned that when this particular constellation was in that particular position, it was roughly midnight. When those stars were setting in the west and these ones were rising in the east, dawn was approaching. This wasn't precise. You couldn't tell someone, it's exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes past sunset, by looking at the stars. But you didn't need to. You needed to know whether you should stay awake and alert or whether you could rest for a while. You needed to know whether morning was still far off or coming soon. The stars told you this. In ancient Egypt, they identified 36 decan stars or star groups, and they used the rising of these decans to divide the night into hours. Different decans rose at different times throughout the year, so the system required knowledge and attention, but it worked. Priests used it to time nighttime rituals. Workers used it to know when their shift was ending. In Polynesia, navigators used the stars not just to cross vast stretches of ocean, but to keep time during those crossings. They knew which stars would be in which positions at which times of night, and this knowledge helped them maintain their sense of time, even when days blurred together at sea. In medieval Europe, monks used the stars to wake for night prayers. Monasteries had specific times for specific prayers throughout the day and night, and during the night, when sundials were useless, the stars and moon helped them know when to wake, when to pray, when to sleep again. But most people weren't monks. Most people went to sleep when it was dark and woke when it was light, and what happened in between didn't require precise tracking. The night was for sleeping, mostly, for resting, for letting time pass without worrying about measuring it. There's something we need to understand about how different this was from how we experience time now. When you check your phone and it says 3:47 p.m., that number is the same whether it's summer or winter, whether you're in a good mood or a bad one, Whether you're busy or idle, time, as we measure it now, is objective, constant, external to experience. But before clocks, time was inseparable from experience. Time was what was happening. Time was the sun on your face and the length of shadows and the chill in the air and the hunger in your belly. Time was the work you were doing and the people around you and the season you were in. A day in summer felt longer than a day in winter because it was longer, measured in sunlight, measured in warmth, measured in work you could accomplish. An hour of hard labor felt different than an hour of rest, and there was no mechanical measurement to tell you they were the same. This made time more flexible, more human, more tied to life as it was actually lived. It also made coordinating with other people more complicated, at least in the ways we think of coordination now. You couldn't say, "Meet me at 3, because there was no 3. Not in the sense of an exact moment that you could both identify independently, but you could say, "Meet me at midday," or "Meet me when the shadow reaches that mark," or "Meet me at dawn," or "Meet me after the morning work is done." And these were precise enough for most purposes, because most purposes didn't require split-second coordination. If you and I were both farmers in neighboring fields, and we agreed to meet when the sun was at a certain height to help each other with some task, we'd both be watching the sun anyway. We'd both notice when it reached that height. We might not arrive at the same moment, but we'd arrive within a span of time that felt close enough to simultaneous. And if one of us was earlier than the other, we'd wait. Time to spare was just time, not anxiety, inducing minutes ticking away on a device in your pocket. The rhythm of a day, before clocks, was determined by needs and light and custom, not by arbitrary divisions. You woke when the sun woke you, or when your body decided you'd slept enough, or when the rooster crowed or the birds started singing loudly. There was no alarm clock, but there were plenty of natural alarms. You worked while there was light to work by and energy to work with. You rested when you needed to rest. You ate when you were hungry and food was ready, which usually aligned with certain parts of the day because routines develop naturally even without clocks. In agricultural societies, which means most societies for most of history, the sun dictated the schedule absolutely. You planted when the season was right. You harvested when the crops were ready. You worked the fields during the long days of summer and did indoor tasks during the short days of winter. But within a single day, there was still rhythm. There were still divisions. In medieval Europe, the church bells divided the day. Monasteries rang bells at specific intervals, marking the times for prayer. And these bells could be heard across the surrounding countryside. People who lived near a monastery could orient their day by these bells, even if they never attended the prayers themselves. The bells rang at what were called the canonical hours: matins before dawn, lauds at dawn, prime in the early morning, terce at mid-morning, sext at midday, none in mid-afternoon, vespers in the evening, and compline before bed. These weren't evenly spaced, and their exact timing shifted with the seasons because they were based on sunrise and sunset, but they provided a structure, a skeleton for the day. In towns and cities, as they grew, other bells joined the monastery bells. Work bells, market bells, curfew bells. Each bell meant something specific, and people learned to organize their time around these sonic markers. But in rural areas, which is where most people lived, there were no bells. There was just the sun, and the work, and the seasons, and the customs that had developed over generations. You learned from childhood what part of the day was for what. You learned by watching adults, by doing, by living inside the rhythm until it became part of you. Let's think about a fairly typical day for someone living in a rural farming community, somewhere in Europe or Asia or Africa, in a time long before mechanical clocks existed. The year is irrelevant. The place is almost irrelevant. The patterns are similar across centuries and continents. The day begins when light begins. Not suddenly, gradually. The darkness outside becomes less dark. Birds begin to sing. The air has a particular quality, a particular temperature. If you're an adult with responsibilities, your body knows this is the time to wake. You've been waking at roughly this time for years. Your body has learned, you rise. You don't check what time it is because that question doesn't make sense in the way we mean it. You might notice whether the dawn seems early or late compared to the day before, whether the season is turning, whether the light looks like rain is coming. There are tasks that happen first thing in the morning, every morning. Tending to animals if you have them, starting a fire if it died overnight, preparing something to eat. These tasks take time, but you're not measuring that time. You're doing what needs doing. When the tasks are done, the early morning has passed and the day has properly begun. Now comes the main work of the day, whatever that work is. If you're a farmer, you head to the fields. The sun is higher now. The dew is drying. This is when you work. You work until the sun is high and hot and your stomach tells you it's time to eat, or until someone brings food, or until the custom of your household says it's the midday break. Maybe you work straight through if the work is urgent and the weather is good and you need to make progress. Maybe you rest in the shade during the hottest part of the day if the culture you're part of does that, if the climate makes that sensible. Time is passing, but you're not counting it. You're in it. The work is the time. The sun's heat is the time. Your growing tiredness is the time. Afternoon arrives not because a clock says it's afternoon, but because the sun's angle changes. The air feels different. Your body feels different. You've been working for hours. You can feel it in your muscles, in your focus. You keep working, or you shift to different tasks, or you rest, depending on what the day demands. The sun continues its arc. Shadows lengthen. The light becomes golden, then amber. This is when you start finishing up. Not because it's 5 o'clock, but because the light is fading, and soon it will be too dim to work effectively, and you need to be back before dark. You return home, or to wherever home is. You eat again. You tend to end-of-day tasks. You talk with family or neighbors. The light fades. Night comes. You might sit by a fire for a while. You might do some task that doesn't require much light. But mostly, when night falls, activity ceases. There's no electric light to extend the day. There's fire. And firelight is precious. And by firelight, you can do some things but not others. Sleep comes when you're tired, and it's dark, and there's nothing else to do. Maybe that's soon after sunset. Maybe it's a few hours later. It depends on the season, the day's work, your own rhythms. And then the cycle repeats. This is time without clocks. Time without numbers. Time as a lived experience, as a series of transitions and tasks and natural markers. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't random. There was structure. But the structure came from the world itself, not from a device strapped to your wrist or mounted on a wall. Different seasons brought different rhythms entirely. In summer, the days were long. There was a vast expanse of light between dawn and dusk. Work could stretch out. There was time for more tasks, more activity. The urgency was in the work itself, crops growing, harvests approaching, not in the hours. In winter, the days were short. Darkness came early. Work compressed into the available light, and there were many hours of darkness to fill with indoor tasks, with rest, with sleep. People slept more in winter, or at least they spent more time in bed, because what else was there to do in the long, cold dark? This seasonal variation in daily rhythm is something we've almost entirely lost. Our days are the same length year-round, measured in hours. We wake to alarms that go off at the same time in January as in July. We work the same schedules. We impose the same structure on winter and summer alike. But for most of human history, human activity expanded and contracted with the daylight. You didn't fight against the seasons. You lived inside them. There were other markers people used, less obvious than the sun and stars, but no less important to those who knew them. The tide. If you lived near the sea, tides follow the moon, rising and falling in predictable cycles twice each day. And people whose lives depended on the sea learned these rhythms intimately. You knew when the tide would be high, when it would be low. You planned fishing, travel, gathering according to the tide. The tide was a clock of sorts, telling you not just when to do things, but often where you needed to be. Animals, too, marked time. Roosters crow at dawn. Though not always exactly at dawn, and sometimes at other times too, but reliably enough that people noticed and used it. Cows need to be milked at roughly regular intervals. Sheep move in certain patterns throughout the day. If you lived with animals, you learned their rhythms, and their rhythms helped structure your own. Hunger was a timekeeper. Your body gets hungry at intervals, and those intervals become somewhat regular if you eat at somewhat regular times, and this creates a feedback loop. You eat when you're hungry. You get hungry around the time you usually eat. Your body becomes a clock of sorts, not a precise one, but functional. Same with tiredness, with alertness. Your body has rhythms, circadian rhythms we call them now, that make you more alert at certain times and more drowsy at others. These rhythms are influenced by light and activity, but they also have an internal component. People noticed this. They noticed that there were parts of the day when they felt energetic and parts when they felt sluggish, and they planned accordingly when they could. Let's move to water for a moment, because water played an interesting role in time measurement, especially in places and times where the sun wasn't always visible or wasn't a convenient reference. The water clock, or clepsydra, is ancient. We have examples from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from China, from Greece, going back thousands of years. The principle is simple. Water flows from one container to another at a relatively steady rate, and you can mark the water level to indicate the passage of time. These were never as common as sundials, probably because they required more maintenance and more precision in construction. But they were useful precisely because they worked at night, indoors, during cloudy weather all the times when the sun couldn't help you. The simplest water clock was just a bowl with a small hole in the bottom. You filled it with water. The water drained out slowly. When the bowl was empty, a certain amount of time had passed. You could mark the inside of the bowl to show different levels for different intervals. More sophisticated water clocks had the water flowing into a container instead of out of one, with a float that rose as the water level rose, and a marker attached to the float that pointed at different hours. Some had gears and mechanisms that made them quite complex. But even a simple water clock required someone to pay attention to it, to refill it, to maintain it. It wasn't passive like a sundial. You had to tend it like you tended a fire. And there was a problem with water clocks that took a very long time to solve. Water doesn't flow at a perfectly steady rate. It flows faster when the container is full and slower as it empties, because the pressure is different. Early water clocks were not very accurate. Over centuries, clever people found ways to improve this. They designed containers with shapes that compensated for the pressure change. They created systems with overflow mechanisms to keep the water level constant in the source container. They got better at it. But even at their best, water clocks were never as simple or as reliable as just looking at the sun. So why did people bother with them? Because there were situations where knowing the time when you couldn't see the sun was important enough to justify the hassle. In ancient courts, water clocks were used to time speeches. Each speaker got a certain amount of time measured by water to make their case. This was fairer than just having someone subjectively decide when a speech had gone on long enough. In some temples and religious settings, Water clocks help time rituals that took place indoors or at night. In astronomy, which was both a science and often a religious practice, water clocks helped track the movements of stars and planets with more precision than casual observation allowed. But for ordinary people, in ordinary daily life, water clocks were mostly irrelevant. You didn't need one. The sun and your own body and the rhythms of your community were sufficient. There's a kind of timekeeping that's easy to overlook because it's so embedded in work itself. Process time. If you've ever baked bread, you know that you can't just mix ingredients and immediately have bread. There are steps. The dough needs to rise, and that takes time. And you can't rush it. You can feel the dough. You can see it. You know when it's ready for the next step, not because a timer went off, but because the dough has changed in a way you recognize. If you've ever worked with clay, or dye, or cheese, or any number of traditional crafts and processes, you know that time is built into the work. You learn how long things take, not in minutes, but in experience. You learn what things look like, feel like, smell like, at different stages. A potter doesn't need a clock to know when clay is leather hard and ready to trim. They touch it. They know. A dyer doesn't need a timer to know when fabric has been in the dye bath long enough. The color tells them. A cheesemaker doesn't need to measure minutes to know when curds are ready to cut. The texture tells them. This kind of knowledge, this kind of time-telling, was everywhere in traditional work. It still is, in work that hasn't been fully mechanized or standardized, and it's a form of timekeeping that's deeply human, deeply connected to skill and attention and experience. Its time is something you develop a feel for, literally. Now let's think about longer periods. Days are one thing, but what about weeks, months, years? The week is interesting because it's not based on any obvious astronomical phenomenon. A day is one rotation of the Earth. A month is roughly one lunar cycle. A year is one orbit around the sun. But a week? A week is 7 days because, well, the reasons are historical and cultural and somewhat arbitrary. Many ancient cultures had week-like divisions of time, but they weren't all 7 days. The Romans originally had an 8-day week called the nundinal cycle, where every 8th day was a market day. Some cultures used 10-day weeks. Some used 5. The 7-day week that's now nearly universal seems to have originated in the ancient Near East, possibly connected to the 7 visible celestial objects, the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets known in antiquity. The Jewish Sabbath, which occurs every 7 days, is very ancient and helped spread the 7-day week through Jewish communities and eventually through Christianity and Islam. But for most of human history, ordinary people probably didn't think much in terms of weeks. They thought in terms of market days, festival days, work days, rest days. The pattern might repeat every 7 days or 8 days or 10 days, but it was the pattern of activities, the rhythm of work and rest and trade and worship that mattered, not the abstract number. Months were easier because the moon made them visible. You could watch the moon wax and wane. You could count moons. 12 moons got you through most of a year, and every culture that paid attention to the moon developed some version of a lunar calendar. The problem with lunar calendars is that 12 lunar months add up to about 354 days, and a solar year, the time it takes Earth to orbit the sun, which is what determines seasons, is about 365 and a quarter days. So if you just count 12 moons and call that a year, your calendar drifts out of sync with the seasons. After a few years, your summer month is happening in spring. After a decade or two, it's complete chaos. Different cultures solved this different ways. Some added an extra month every few years to get back in sync with the seasons. The ancient Hebrew calendar did this. The Chinese calendar did this. It's called intercalation. And it works. But it requires someone to decide when to add the extra month, and that requires either astronomical observation or adherence to a established pattern. Some cultures just let the calendar drift. The Islamic calendar is purely lunar and doesn't try to stay aligned with the solar year. This means Islamic months move through the seasons over the years, and that's intentional, not a failure to solve the problem. Some cultures eventually abandoned lunar calendars in favor of solar ones. The ancient Egyptians developed a solar calendar very early, with 12 months of 30 days each plus 5 extra days at the end of the year. It wasn't perfect, they didn't account for the extra quarter day each year, but it was simpler than trying to coordinate the moon and the sun. The calendar we use now, the Gregorian calendar, is solar. Our months are named after Roman months and have no connection to the actual lunar cycle anymore. February sometimes has the moon full at the beginning and end and new in the middle, sometimes the opposite, and we don't notice or care because our months aren't about the moon anymore. But for the vast majority of human history, watching the moon was how you knew what month you were in, and learning to predict when to add an extra month or how to stay oriented despite the drift between moon and sun was specialized knowledge that some people had and most people didn't worry about too much. Years were marked by seasons more than by numbers. If you asked a farmer in medieval England what year it was, they might not know in the sense of a numbered year from some starting point. They might know it was the 3rd year of the king's reign, or 7 years since the bad harvest, or the year they got married, or something like that. Time was relational, marked by events rather than by an absolute numbering system. The idea of numbering years from a fixed point, anno domini, before Common Era, whatever system you use is relatively recent in the scale of human history, and it was mostly relevant to people who kept written records. Everyone else oriented themselves in time, through stories, through memory, through the rhythm of recurring events. Harvest came every year, planting came every year, winter came every year, certain festivals happened every year. The cycle repeated, and the cycle was what mattered. You knew you were getting older because you remembered more cycles. You knew historical events by how many cycles ago they happened. Someone might say, that happened when I was about the age my son is now, rather than that happened in the year 1347. This isn't imprecise, exactly. It's a different kind of precision. It's precision tied to human experience and memory rather than to abstract measurement. Let's think about what happened when people needed to coordinate activities between different places. If you were a merchant traveling between towns, you needed to know when market days were in each town. But market days were local knowledge, local custom. One town might have market on every 7th day. Another town might have it every 9 days. Another might have it on the full moon. You learned this the way you learned anything. By asking, by observing, by remembering. And once you knew the pattern, you could plan your travels around it. But there was no universal synchronization. There couldn't be. Each community kept time in its own way, based on its own needs and customs and the tools available to it. This started to change very slowly as trade and communication networks grew, as cities grew. As organizations that spanned multiple locations, the Catholic Church, for instance, or large-scale merchant networks, needed ways to coordinate activity across distances. The Church was actually one of the driving forces toward more standardized time. Monasteries needed to perform the same prayers at the same times, even monasteries in different places. This required some agreement about how to divide the day, about when certain times occurred. This is part of what drove the improvement of water clocks, and eventually the invention of mechanical clocks in medieval Europe. The church needed to ring bells at the right times for prayers, and determining the right times required measurement that didn't depend on the sun, which wasn't always visible and wasn't always a convenient reference point, especially for prayers that happened in the middle of the night. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're approaching the moment when mechanical clocks enter the picture, and we're not there yet. We're still in the long era before them, and there's more to notice about how people lived in that era. Let's come back to bodies, to the personal, to the intimate experience of time. Your body has clocks built into it. We know this now in great detail because of scientific study of circadian rhythms and chronobiology. But people knew it then too, in a different way. They knew it from living inside their bodies. You get tired at roughly the same time each night if you keep a reasonably consistent schedule. You wake at roughly the same time each morning. You get hungry at meal times. Your body temperature varies over the course of the day. Your alertness varies. Your physical coordination varies. All of this happens whether you measure it or not, whether you have clocks or not. And in a world without clocks, these bodily rhythms were more noticeable, more attended to. You couldn't override them as easily. You couldn't decide to stay up much later than usual just by turning on lights and drinking coffee. Well, you could stay up, but you'd be sitting in darkness or by weak firelight, probably getting sleepier and sleepier because your body was telling you it was time to sleep. The natural rhythm was wake with light, sleep with darkness, work when alert, rest when tired. Of course, people overrode this when necessary. New parents wake throughout the night to tend babies, same as now. People who were sick or anxious slept poorly. People who were excited or worried stayed up later than usual. Guards kept watch through the night in shifts. Bakers started work before dawn. But these were deviations from a norm, and the norm was set by the sun and the body, not by a decision about what time you'd set your alarm for. There's something else about time without clocks. It was less stressful in some ways. You couldn't be exactly late because there was no exact time to be late for. You could be later than expected, later than appropriate, but the boundary was fuzzy. If you were supposed to meet someone at dawn and you arrived when the sun was clearly up, you were late. But if you arrived when the sun was just rising versus when it had just risen, that ambiguity was just part of life. There was no counting down minutes, no watching seconds tick away, no anxiety about whether you'd make it on time to something scheduled for 3 because there was no 3. This doesn't mean people weren't worried about getting things done. Of course they were. Farmers worried about getting crops in before rain came. Travelers worried about reaching their destination before dark. Workers worried about finishing tasks before they ran out of daylight. But the worry was about the task and the conditions, not about an arbitrary measurement they were racing against. Time was more forgiving in its lack of precision and more demanding in its connection to real consequences. You couldn't check the time and decide you still had 15 minutes to spare. You had to look at the actual situation, the actual sky, the actual light, the actual progress of your work and make a judgment. This required more attention to the world and less attention to devices. It required more skill at reading natural signs and less dependence on external authorities telling you what time it was. Different types of work created different relationships to time. A shepherd, spending long hours watching sheep, had vast amounts of time that was simultaneously full and empty. Full because the sheep needed watching, because predators or dangers could appear, because the sheep themselves were always moving and grazing and needing to be kept together. Empty because much of that time involved waiting, watching, being present but not actively doing much. A shepherd learned to be comfortable with time passing slowly. Learned to notice small changes. Learned to tell time by the smallest shifts in light, in temperature, in the behavior of animals. A blacksmith, by contrast, worked in a world of intense, focused bursts. Heating metal, hammering it, shaping it. These tasks required full attention and created their own rhythm. The metal told you when it was hot enough to work. The shape emerging under your hammer told you when you were done. Time collapsed into the work itself. A weaver worked at a steady, repetitive pace. Thread by thread, row by row, the cloth grew. You could see time accumulating in the growing fabric. A day's work was a certain amount of cloth. A week's work was more. The work measured itself. Each type of work taught a different relationship to time, a different way of experiencing its passage. And within any given life, you probably did different types of work at different times: seasonal work, daily work, work that varied by age and ability, so you experienced time in all these different ways, and you learned to shift between them. We should think about festivals and holy days because they were crucial markers in the year, ways of organizing time that had nothing to do with measurement and everything to do with meaning. Every culture had these days that were special, set apart from ordinary time, days of celebration, of rest, of ritual, of remembering. Some were tied to agricultural cycles, harvest festivals, planting festivals, first fruits. These made perfect sense in agricultural societies. They marked the rhythm of the year in a way that was both practical and sacred. Some were tied to astronomical events, the solstices, the equinoxes, the full moon, the new moon. These connected human time to cosmic time, reminded people that they were part of something larger. Some were tied to religious or historical events, the birth of a prophet, a great victory, a miraculous occurrence. These were about collective memory, about identity, about maintaining connection to the past. And these festivals weren't just markers, they were experiences of different time. Festival time was different from work time. It had different rules, different expectations. You didn't work on holy days, or you worked differently. You wore different clothes. You ate different food. You gathered with people you might not see otherwise. This created a rhythm to the year that went beyond the simple counting of days. The year had texture. It had peaks and valleys. It had moments of intensity and periods of ordinariness. And you always knew, roughly, where you were in this rhythm. You knew how long it had been since the last festival. You knew how long until the next one. You knew what season you were in, partly by knowing which festivals had passed and which were coming. This is time as story, rather than time as number. Time as a series of meaningful events, rather than a series of identical units. Let's think about children for a moment, about how they learned time. A child born into a world without clocks learned to tell time the way they learned everything else, by watching, by doing, by gradually absorbing the patterns of the world around them. They learned that when the light looks a certain way, it's time to come inside. They learned that when their stomach feels a certain way, food will appear soon. They learned the sequence of daily tasks, the rhythm of the seasons, the pattern of festivals. They learned by their body growing, by their abilities changing, by what they were allowed to do and expected to do shifting as they got older. A 5-year-old couldn't do much useful work, but could do some simple tasks. A 10-year-old could do more. A 15-year-old was nearly an adult, capable of adult work. These weren't precise age markers. People often didn't know exactly how old they were, but they were developmental stages that everyone recognized. Time passing was marked by growth, by learning, by changing roles within the family and community. And children learned patience differently, perhaps. They learned that some things just take time. Seeds take time to grow. Animals take time to mature. Skills take time to develop. You can't rush these things. You can only do your part and wait. This is very different from the relationship to time that children develop now, with constant stimulation and instant access to information and entertainment, and the expectation that waiting is something to be minimized or eliminated. In a world without clocks, waiting was just part of life. You waited for the season to change. You waited for the sun to rise. You waited for bread to bake. You waited for visitors to arrive. You waited, and waiting was normal. Now let's think about something that might seem small but wasn't. The moment of transition between one part of the day and another. Without clocks, these transitions were gradual and somewhat ambiguous. Morning became mid-morning, became noon, became afternoon in a continuous slide, not in discrete jumps. You couldn't point to an exact instant when morning ended. It ended when the sun had risen enough, when the day had warmed enough, when you'd been working for a certain amount of time. All of these happened gradually. This meant that different people might disagree slightly about what part of the day it was, especially in the middle ranges between obvious markers. Was it still morning, or was it midday? Depended on how you felt, what you were doing, how you were judging it. This ambiguity wasn't a problem. It was just reality. Time was fuzzy at the edges, but there were moments that were unmistakable. Dawn was unmistakable. Noon, when the sun was highest and shadows shortest, was unmistakable. Dusk was unmistakable. Night was unmistakable. These clear markers gave structure. The fuzzy periods between them gave flexibility. It's worth thinking about language, about how people talked about time when they didn't have precise measurements. They used comparison. I'll meet you when the shadow reaches that tree. Come back when the bread is done. We'll leave at dawn. They used sequence. After we finish this, we'll do that. Before the sun sets, we need to complete this task. They used approximation. About midday. Late in the afternoon. Early morning, they used reference to natural phenomena. When the dew is dry. When the birds start their evening song. When the star appears. All of this is less precise than saying 2:30 p.m., but it's not imprecise. It's differently precise. It's precision tied to observable reality rather than to arbitrary measurement. And it required both speaker and listener to share knowledge of what these references meant. You had to both know what the evening bird song sounded like when it typically happened. You had to both know how long bread typically took to bake. You had to both be able to look at the same shadow and agree roughly where the designated point was. This shared knowledge was part of what bound communities together. You learned your community's way of talking about time, of marking time, of organizing time, and this learning made you part of the community. Strangers, travelers, outsiders might not know these local references. They'd have to ask, to learn, to adjust to the local way of doing things. Time was local in a way that's hard to imagine now, when time zones span entire regions and everyone's clocks show the same minutes and seconds. Let's shift to thinking about longer durations, about how people estimated spans of time longer than a day. If someone asked you how long something would take, you answered in days or weeks or seasons, not in hours. A journey might take 3 days. Building a house might take all summer. A pregnancy took the better part of a year. People knew this very precisely from observation, even if they didn't know the exact number of days. These durations were known through experience and observation. People did things repeatedly and learned how long they took. They watched things happen and learned their time scales. If you'd made the journey between two towns several times, you knew it took about 3 days, give or take, depending on weather and how fast you walked and whether anything went wrong. You couldn't say it was exactly 67 hours, but you didn't need to. 3 days was plenty precise. If you'd helped build houses before, you knew that a modest house could be built in a summer by a small crew, or faster with more help, or slower if the weather was bad. The time expanded and contracted based on conditions, and that was expected. This flexibility is important. Without precise measurement, estimates had to include implicit ranges. About 3 days meant maybe 2.5, maybe 3.5, depending on circumstances. Everyone understood this. No one expected rigid predictability. There's another aspect of time we haven't touched much yet. Memory, and how it shaped the perception of time. Without written records, which most people didn't have, memory was how you kept track of when things happened. And memory doesn't store things in neat chronological order. It stores them by significance, by connection, by emotion. You might remember that something happened the summer there was a drought, or the winter your father died, or the year of the great storm. These personal or shared events became reference points, and other memories clustered around them. This created a kind of lumpy timeline, where some periods were rich with remembered events and others were sparse. Years that were eventful felt full and were easy to place in memory. Years that were routine and uneventful might blur together. Time flies when you're having fun, and a watched pot never boils. These cliches point to something real about how time perception varies with attention and emotion. And in a world without clocks to impose objective measurement, these variations in subjective time were all you had. A day of hard, engaging work might pass quickly in experience but feel long when you thought back on everything you'd accomplished. A day of boredom or waiting might drag endlessly in the moment but leave little trace in memory. None of this could be measured. It could only be experienced. We should consider the transmission of time knowledge across generations. How did people learn to tell time without clocks? The same way they learned everything else that mattered, from their elders through observation and practice. A child learned to judge the sun's position by going with adults to the fields and hearing them say things like, "We should head back soon. The sun's getting low," and then watching the sun and seeing what low meant, and then the next day paying a bit more attention, and over years developing the same eye their elders had. A child learned to read the weather, to predict rain or clear skies, by watching clouds with someone who already knew, who could say, "See how those clouds look? That means rain by evening," and then being proven right or wrong, and over time learning the patterns. A child learns seasonal markers, when to expect certain plants to bloom, certain birds to migrate, certain weather patterns by living through the seasons repeatedly and paying attention. This knowledge was practical and essential. If you couldn't read the signs of time, you couldn't organize your work effectively. You couldn't plan. You couldn't coordinate with others. But it was also deep knowledge that took years to fully develop. An experienced farmer could look at the sky, the plants, the feel of the air, and predict with surprising accuracy when the first frost would come. This wasn't magic. It was accumulated observation. A young farmer, even one who'd grown up farming, didn't have that depth of experience yet. They had the basics, but the subtle judgments came with time. This meant that elders had real value in their ability to read time and seasons and weather. They'd seen more cycles, they remembered more variations, they could make better predictions, and this knowledge was communal. It was shared, discussed, compared. Farmers would talk about what signs they were seeing, what they expected, what they remembered from years past. Through this conversation, collective knowledge was maintained and refined. Let's think about what happened when something disrupted the usual patterns of timekeeping. During an eclipse, the sun would darken in the middle of the day. Birds would stop singing, thinking night was coming. Animals would behave strangely. The whole natural system of timekeeping would become confused. For people who didn't understand what an eclipse was, this was terrifying. The sun was the primary timekeeper, the reliable constant, and now it was failing. Stories and myths about eclipses often involve the sun being eaten or attacked, and you can understand why it would feel like an attack on the very order of things. Even for people who understood eclipses intellectually, who could predict them using astronomical knowledge, they still disrupted the day. Work would pause. People would watch. The world would feel off balance until the sun returned. Or consider seasons that didn't behave normally. A late spring where cold lingered and plants didn't grow on their usual schedule. This would throw off all the seasonal markers people depended on. You'd expect certain signs at certain times, and they wouldn't come, and you'd have to adjust, to wait, to remain uncertain. Unusual weather, a very cloudy period where you couldn't see the sun for days would make solar timekeeping difficult. You'd have to rely more on routine, on estimation, on guessing. These disruptions highlight how much people depended on the regularity of natural cycles. When those cycles were reliable, you could build your life around them. When they were disrupted, you had to fall back on less certain methods. But people adapted. They always adapted. Humans are remarkably good at functioning in uncertainty, at making do with imperfect information. Now let's think about specialized timekeepers. People whose role involved paying more attention to time than most. In many cultures, there were people, priests, astronomers, specialists of various kinds who tracked time more carefully than ordinary people needed to. They might keep records of celestial events. They might maintain calendars. They might be responsible for declaring when certain festivals should occur, especially festivals that depended on astronomical calculations rather than obvious events. In ancient Babylon, priest astronomers tracked the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision, recording their observations on clay tablets. They developed systems for predicting eclipses, for tracking the cycles of Venus and Jupiter, for maintaining calendars. This knowledge was specialized and often secret. It gave the priests power, the power of knowing things others didn't, of being able to predict things that seemed unpredictable. In many cultures, the person who declared when the new moon had arrived, and therefore when a new month began, had significant authority. They were the official timekeeper for the community. This is very different from our experience, where time is democratic. Anyone can check what time it is. Anyone has access to the same temporal information. But for most of history, there were levels of time knowledge and specialists who had more precise or more extensive knowledge than common people. Of course, this also meant that common people had to trust the specialists. If the priest said it was time for a certain ritual, you did the ritual, even if you couldn't verify the timing yourself. This trust was usually warranted. The specialists generally knew what they were doing, and their knowledge had been built up over generations. But it also meant that timekeeping had a political and social dimension. Control over the calendar, over the declaration of feast days and fast days, was a form of power. Let's consider traveling again, but in more detail. When you traveled beyond your familiar territory, you entered areas where the local time markers might be different. Different customs about when the day started. Different bell schedules if there were bells. Different names for parts of the day. And you couldn't just check your phone to know what time it was in this new place. You had to observe, to ask, to adapt. If you arrived in a new town at what you'd call midday, but they were calling early afternoon because they divided the day slightly differently, you just had to accept that you were now operating on their time, not yours. This didn't really matter for most purposes. You'd still eat when you were hungry and sleep when you were tired. But if you needed to coordinate with locals to arrive for a market, to meet someone, to catch some scheduled event, you had to learn their system. Long-distance travelers developed skills at this. Merchants who traveled regularly between towns learned the various local customs. They learned to be flexible, to ask questions, to not assume their way of doing things was universal. And when travelers came together from different places, they had to negotiate a shared understanding of time. Let's meet at dawn worked because dawn was universal. Let's meet at the third hour only worked if you agreed on what counted as the first hour. This negotiation, this need to communicate across different systems, eventually created pressure towards standardization. But that pressure took centuries to result in actual standardization. And we're still talking about times long before it happened. Let's go very far back for a moment, to prehistoric times, to humans before any kind of civilization, before agriculture, before settled communities. Hunter-gatherers needed to tell time too. They needed to know when animals would be in certain places, when plants would be ripe for gathering, when to move camp, When winter was coming, they had the same basic tools as everyone else. The sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons. But they used them in the context of a mobile lifestyle without fixed reference points like buildings or planted fields. They learned the patterns of animal migration. They knew when herds would pass through certain areas, when fish would be running in rivers, when birds would be nesting. They learned the patterns of plant growth. They knew when certain roots would be ready to dig, when certain berries would be ripe, when certain nuts would fall. All of this required close observation of nature, of cycles within cycles. A bird's migration might signal that a certain plant would be ready soon. The blooming of one flower might indicate that another food source was about to become available. This was time not as abstract measurement, but as a web of connections and patterns in the natural world. And memory was crucial. Elders who remembered many cycles, who could recall when certain rare events happened and what preceded them, were invaluable. They were living libraries of temporal knowledge. We have evidence that even very ancient peoples tracked celestial events with surprising sophistication. Stone circles, aligned to solstices or equinoxes, cave paintings that might represent lunar phases, carved bones with marks that might be counting days. These weren't clocks in any modern sense, but they were attempts to mark time, to track it, to understand it. The impulse to measure time, to track its passage, to predict its patterns, is very old. It's arguably a fundamental human impulse. We are temporal creatures. We live in time. We're aware of time. We try to understand it. But for most of history, that understanding was qualitative rather than quantitative. It was about patterns and rhythms rather than numbers. Let's think about the night in more detail, because we've mostly focused on daytime. Night was less structured than day for most people. The primary activity at night was sleeping, and sleep didn't require timekeeping. But night wasn't uniform. There was early night, when the sun had just set and some light remained in the sky. There was deep night, the darkest hours. There was late night, when the sky began to lighten again. People who needed to track these divisions, guards, monks, anyone who had to be awake and active at night, learned to read them. The stars helped. Different constellations rose and set at different times. If you knew the stars, you could estimate the time at night with reasonable accuracy. The moon helped when it was visible. Its position in the sky, like the sun's, changed predictably over the course of the night. But on cloudy nights with no moon, you were working with less information. You had to rely on your internal sense of time, on how tired you felt, on how much time seemed to have passed. This internal time sense is actually more accurate than you might think, at least for rough estimates. If someone woke you in the middle of the night and asked you to guess how long you'd been asleep, you'd probably get within an hour or two of the right answer, maybe closer, especially if you were used to doing this kind of estimation. Your body tracks time even when you're not conscious. Sleep has stages that cycle through the night. You're more likely to wake naturally at certain points than others. People who regularly woke at certain times for night prayers or night work often found they'd wake automatically, without any external signal, at roughly the right time. This isn't perfect, but it worked often enough to be relied upon. In communities with night watches, guards protecting against animals or raiders, the night would be divided into watches, shifts of duty. The length of each watch might be marked by a water clock if they had one, or simply by agreement and rough estimation. The person finishing a watch would wake the next person. That person would stay awake for what felt like a similar length of time, then wake the next person. Over the course of the night, everyone would take a turn. This system didn't require knowing the exact time. It just required a rough sense of fairness, of equal division. As long as no one cheated dramatically, it worked fine. Now, let's think about something that might seem paradoxical. The idea that time moved at different speeds in different contexts. We talked earlier about temporal hours, hours that stretched or contracted with the seasons, but there's another sense in which time moved at different speeds, subjectively, experientially. Time dragged during periods of boredom, or waiting, or suffering. It flew during periods of absorption or joy, or intense activity. This is still true for us, of course. Subjective time and objective time don't match, but we have objective time, clock time, to anchor us. We can look at a clock and say, that meeting felt like 3 hours, but it was only 1. And the clock gives us the truth. Without clocks, there was no such anchor. If time felt like it was moving slowly, it was moving slowly. That was the only time there was. This made some experiences feel very different than they would now. A long winter night, if you were awake for part of it, could feel endless. The darkness went on and on. You had no way of knowing exactly how much of the night remained. You just had to wait for dawn. A period of illness, confined to bed, unable to do much, could feel like time had stopped entirely. Days blurred together. You lost track of how long you'd been sick. But a season of good weather and good work could pass in what felt like a flash. Busy days stacked on busy days, and suddenly harvest was over and winter was coming, and where had the time gone? People noticed this variability. They talked about it. They had expressions for it, similar to the ones we still use. Time flies. Time drags. The days are long, but the years are short. But without measurement to contradict their experience, their subjective sense of time was, in a very real way, their actual experience of time. Let's think about synchronization across distance one more time, because it's such an alien concept in a world of clocks. If you lived in a village, and someone in another village 5 miles away, you couldn't easily synchronize your activities to happen at the same time unless you were both doing something obvious, like at dawn or at sunset. If you wanted to do something at the same moment as someone far away, you needed a shared signal, a fire on a hilltop that both could see, a messenger who traveled between locations, some external coordination. This meant that most coordination happened locally. The people you coordinated with were the people you could see or hear or easily communicate with. A town might have bells that everyone in town could hear, creating synchronized time within the town. But the next town over would have its own bells, on its own schedule, and there was no effort to make the two towns' schedules match. This was fine. Why would they need to match? Each town operated independently. As long as everyone within a town agreed on when things were happening, that was sufficient. But it meant that noon in one town might be slightly different than noon in a town 10 miles away, even if both were trying to mark true solar noon. The person in charge of the bells in each town might judge the sun's highest point slightly differently, or the towns might be far enough apart east-west that solar noon actually did occur at different times. None of this mattered until travel and communication became fast enough that these small differences became noticeable and problematic. And that didn't happen until much later, until trains and telegraphs, long after mechanical clocks existed. We should talk about hourglasses and sandglasses because they're a form of timekeeping we haven't really covered. The hourglass, 2 glass bulbs connected by a narrow neck, with sand flowing from one to the other, is a simple and elegant timer. When all the sand has flowed through, a set amount of time has passed. Flip it over, and you can time another period. Hourglasses probably appeared in medieval Europe, though the exact origin is unclear. They were useful for timing specific tasks. Sermons, so the preacher knew when to wrap up. Ship watches, to mark the passage of half-hour intervals at sea. Cooking, to time various processes. But hourglasses had limitations. Each one timed a specific duration the time it took for the sand to flow through. If you wanted to time different lengths, you needed different hourglasses. They also required someone to pay attention and flip them. They weren't continuous like a sundial or a water clock. They measured intervals, not the time of day. Still, they were portable, relatively reliable, and didn't require sunlight or careful maintenance. A sailor could carry an hourglass on a ship. A cook could keep one in the kitchen. A scholar could use one to pace their work. Hourglasses were never as central to timekeeping as the sun or bells, but they filled a useful niche for timing specific tasks. Let's return to the question of why people eventually felt the need for more precise timekeeping, why mechanical clocks were invented at all. For most purposes, the sun and the seasons and the body were sufficient. They remained sufficient for most people for centuries after mechanical clocks were invented. But there were contexts where more precision was useful. Monasteries, as we've mentioned, needed to mark specific prayer times throughout the day and night. Water clocks helped, but they required maintenance and weren't perfectly reliable. Navigation at sea benefited from precise time measurement. Knowing the exact time allowed you to calculate longitude, though this wasn't fully understood or utilized until later. Astronomy required precise timing to make useful observations and predictions. And as societies became more complex, as cities grew, as commerce expanded, there was increasing value in being able to coordinate activities precisely. If you're a merchant and you say you'll deliver goods mid-morning, that's fine for local trade. But if you're coordinating with multiple parties, some of whom are traveling from a distance, more precision helps. If you're managing a workplace with many workers, knowing exactly how long people have been working, being able to start and end shifts at defined times makes organization easier. If you're running a court or government, having precise time records can matter for legal proceedings, for organizing meetings, for coordinating between different offices. These pressures were building slowly over centuries. They eventually led to the development and spread of mechanical clocks. But that's another story. The story of after, not the story of before. What we're concerned with here is the long era before, the millennia when humans lived without the ability to know precisely what time it was and managed just fine. Because they did manage. They built civilizations. They created art and literature and philosophy. They navigated oceans. They developed agriculture and architecture and mathematics. All without knowing whether it was 3 to 47 or 3:48. They knew whether it was morning or afternoon. They knew whether planting season had arrived. They knew whether they had time to finish a task before dark. They knew whether they were late for an obligation. They knew the time and the ways that mattered for the lives they were living. Let's think about the transition periods. The times when old ways of timekeeping were supplemented but not yet replaced by new ones. When mechanical clocks first appeared in European towns, usually in church towers or town halls, they coexisted with sundials and bells and all the traditional methods. Most people didn't have personal access to these early clocks. They might hear a clock strike the hour if they lived close enough to the tower, but they couldn't check it whenever they wanted. So they continued to use the sun, to estimate, to rely on bells that were now rung at times determined by the clock rather than by someone's judgment. This created an interesting hybrid. Time was becoming more standardized, more mechanical, but most people's experience of time was still mediated by natural and traditional markers. A farmer might know, vaguely, that when they heard the church clock strike a certain number of times, that meant it was around the time they usually stopped for the midday meal. But they weren't thinking it's noon in the abstract sense. They were thinking, that's the signal that aligns with midday. The clock was just another marker, like the sun's position or the length of shadows. It was more precise than those markers, but it wasn't necessarily more important. This slow transition from time as natural phenomenon to time as mechanical measurement took centuries. It wasn't a sudden shift. It was a gradual layering of new tools and new concepts onto old patterns. And for many people, for most people really, life continued much as it had. They still woke with the sun and slept with darkness. They still worked according to the seasons. They still experienced time as a flow rather than a series of numbered units. The clock was there, ticking away in the tower, dividing time into equal hours. But below, in the streets and fields, people were still living in a more ancient relationship with time. Let's consider what was lost when time became mechanical. What aspects of the older way of timekeeping had value that we might not fully appreciate? There was an attentiveness to nature that was necessary when nature was your clock. You had to notice the sky, the light, the air. You had to pay attention. This attention connected you to the world you lived in. You weren't separate from nature, looking at it through a window or experiencing it on weekends. You were embedded in it, reading it constantly. There was a flexibility that came from time being fuzzy around the edges. You could adapt to circumstances because you weren't locked into a rigid schedule. If the weather was good and you wanted to keep working, you could. If you were tired or the work was done, you could stop. The time didn't dictate, the situation did. There was a local quality to time that created distinctiveness. Each place had its own rhythms, its own markers. Time in a fishing village was different from time in a farming village was different from time in a city. This local variation is something we've almost entirely lost. Time is now global, standardized. 3 p.m. is 3 p.m. everywhere in the same time zone, regardless of what's actually happening with the sun, or the seasons, or the local community. There was also a kind of democracy to natural time. Everyone had access to the sun. Everyone could see the moon. The rich might have had water clocks, or early mechanical clocks, but the basic ability to orient yourself in time was available to everyone. When time became mechanical, when precise time required a device, there was a period where access to precise time was restricted to those who could afford devices. This created a new kind of inequality. Of course, there were losses even in the old system, losses we don't often think about because we're so far removed from it. There was uncertainty. You couldn't always be sure exactly how much time you had. You couldn't plan with the precision we take for granted. There was difficulty coordinating across distance. You couldn't easily synchronize with people far away. There was dependence on weather. Cloudy days made solar timekeeping difficult. You had to fall back on estimation and hope. And there was the simple fact that many tasks are easier, many things are possible, with precise time measurement that weren't possible without it. We couldn't have built the modern world without clocks. The factories, the railways, the global communication networks, all of these require a level of temporal coordination that natural timekeeping can't provide. But we've lost something too. We've lost the intimacy with natural rhythms. We've lost the flexibility. We've lost some of the richness of experiencing time as varied and alive, rather than as uniform and mechanical. Let's think about dreams and sleep for a moment, because they're related to time in interesting ways. Without alarm clocks, people woke naturally. Sometimes this meant sleeping until their body was done sleeping. Sometimes it meant waking with the dawn because light filtered into wherever they were sleeping. There's evidence that people in pre-industrial societies often slept in two segments. They'd sleep for several hours after dark, then wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, then sleep again until dawn. This pattern, called segmented sleep or first sleep and second sleep, was apparently quite common. During the period between sleeps, people might do quiet tasks, talk, pray, have sex, tend fires. It was a peaceful, reflective time. This pattern makes sense if you think about long winter nights. 12 or 14 hours of darkness is a long time to sleep continuously. Breaking it up makes it more manageable. But it only works if you're not trying to wake at a specific time, if you can let your body follow its natural rhythms. Once alarm clocks became common, once people needed to wake at precise times to catch trains or start factory shifts, Segmented sleep largely disappeared. We forced ourselves into continuous sleep schedules to match the demands of mechanical time. This is one small example of how the imposition of clock time changed, not just how we track time, but how we live in time, how we structure our most basic activities. We're moving toward the end now, toward a place where we can pause and reflect on everything we've thought about. Time before clocks was time lived rather than time measured. It was time experienced through the body, through the senses, through the rhythms of the natural world and human community. It was time that varied with the seasons, that expanded and contracted, that felt different in different contexts. It was time that required attention, observation, skill. It was time that connected you to the sun and moon and stars, to the land, to the people around you. It wasn't primitive. It wasn't crude. It was sophisticated in its own way. A way different from mechanical sophistication, but no less real. Humans lived this way for millennia. They built great civilizations this way. They navigated oceans, created art, developed philosophy, raised families, found meaning. They didn't need to know the exact hour and minute. They needed to know where they were in the day, in the season, in the cycle of life. And they knew. Their bodies knew. Their eyes knew. Their accumulated experience knew. The woman standing in her doorway at the beginning of our story, watching the shadows lengthen, didn't need a clock to tell her that evening was approaching, that there were perhaps 2 hours of good light remaining, that she should think about finishing her tasks and preparing for night. She knew the way you know your own name, automatically, certainly, without needing to check. This kind of knowing is still available to us if we pay attention. The sun still rises and sets. The moon still cycles through its phases. The seasons still turn. But most of us don't pay attention anymore. We don't need to. We have devices that tell us the time, that wake us, that remind us of appointments, that structure our days with precision and rigidity. We've gained something enormous. The ability to coordinate complex activities across vast distances, to measure tiny intervals, to standardize and synchronize in ways that have enabled technological and social developments that would have been impossible otherwise. But we've also lost something. The intimate connection to natural time. The flexibility, the attention to the world that was necessary when the world itself was your timekeeper. Neither way is better or worse in absolute terms. They're suited to different ways of life, different needs, different worlds. But understanding how time worked before clocks, how humans oriented themselves temporally for most of our existence, gives us perspective on our current relationship with time. It reminds us that the way we experience time now, as numbered hours and minutes, as a scarce resource to be managed, as something that feels like it's always running out, is not the only way, not the natural way, just the way we've chosen or been pushed into by the demands of modern life. And maybe, on occasion, we can step outside that framework. We can spend a day without checking the time, letting the sun guide us, letting our body guide us, letting tasks take as long as they take. We can remember that we are animals who evolved to live by the rhythms of the earth, and that those rhythms are still there, still accessible, still running beneath the artificial time of our clocks and schedules. The sun is setting somewhere right now. Shadows are lengthening. The light is fading from gold to amber to dim blue. Someone somewhere is noticing this, is feeling the day coming to an end, is moving toward rest and warmth and the quiet of evening. They might check their watch. They might see that it says 6:47 p.m., but they might also just know, in a deeper way, that the day is ending. That knowing is ancient. It's human. It predates every clock ever made, and it's still there, waiting, if we remember to notice. The moon is rising. The stars will appear soon. The night will pass at its own pace, measured in the turning of constellations, in the depth of silence, in the slow restoration that comes with sleep. And then, inevitably, gently, the sky will lighten again. The birds will sing. Another day will begin. Not because a clock says so, because the earth keeps turning, the sun keeps shining, and time keeps flowing like it always has, like it always will, regardless of whether anyone is measuring it at all. We've traveled a long way through this landscape of time, without clocks. We've watched the sun arc across the sky, followed the moon through its phases, noticed the shadows moving, felt the seasons turning. We've stood with farmers in fields, with shepherds on hillsides, with sailors under stars, with all the countless people who lived their entire lives without ever knowing the precise hour. They're gone now, those people. Their specific lives, their individual moments, have been lost to time. But the way they experienced time, the way they lived in time, that's not entirely gone. It's there in our bodies, in our circadian rhythms, in the way we still respond to dawn and dusk even when we're trying to ignore them. It's there in the pleasure we feel sitting outside watching the sunset, in the peace that comes from a day spent hiking without checking the time, in the joy of losing track of hours while absorbed in some activity. These moments of timelessness, of living in time rather than by time, are inheritances from that long era before clocks. They remind us of a different way of being, a way that's still possible, still accessible, even in a world saturated with precise temporal measurement. The story of how time was measured before clocks is really the story of how humans lived in deep relationship with the world, reading it constantly, adapting to it, being shaped by it while also shaping it through their activities and observations. It's a story of patience and attention, of communal knowledge passed through generations, of working with natural limits rather than trying to overcome them. It's a story that ended in most places with the gradual adoption of mechanical timekeeping. But endings are never complete. The old ways persist in remnants, in habits, in the structure of our language and thought. We still say, "in the meantime," and "time flies," and "dawn of a new era," using temporal metaphors drawn from a world where time was sun and moon and seasons, not numbers on a screen. We still organize our years around seasonal festivals, even if we've forgotten their agricultural origins. We still feel different in summer than in winter, even if our schedules don't change. We still carry, in our bodies and our collective memory, traces of that older relationship with time. And perhaps there's value in remembering it. Not to return to it, we can't, and probably wouldn't want to, but to understand it, to appreciate it, to recognize that the way we live now is a choice, one of many possible ways of organizing human life in time. The clocks will keep ticking. The minutes will keep passing, evenly, precisely, relentlessly. But the sun will also keep rising and setting. The seasons will keep turning. The moon will keep waxing and waning. And somewhere in the intersection of mechanical time and natural time, we make our lives, moment by moment, day by day, always moving forward through the mystery that is time itself. The shadows have grown very long now in our imagined village. Night is coming. The woman has finished her work or left it undone until tomorrow. Her family is gathering inside, near the warmth of the fire. They don't know what hour it is. They don't need to. They know it's evening, time for rest, time for food, time for the quiet conversations that happen when the day's work is done. Soon they'll sleep, and time will pass unmarked while they sleep, and the world will turn, and the sun will rise again, and they'll wake to another day, another cycle, another chance to live in time without needing to measure it exactly. This is how it was. This is how humans lived for thousands of years. Not in ignorance or confusion, but in a different kind of knowing. a knowing tied to the earth and sky and body, a knowing that didn't require numbers but was no less real for that. And in remembering this, in understanding this, we might find a small measure of peace, a reminder that time is not just what the clock says it is, that we have other ways of orienting ourselves in the flow of moments, ways that are older and deeper and still, if we're quiet and attentive, still available to us. The night is here. The stars are appearing. Everything is settling into the ancient rhythm of dark and light, waking and sleeping, the rhythm that existed before the first clock was invented, and that will continue long after the last clock stops ticking. And in that rhythm there is rest and peace and a kind of timelessness that paradoxically comes from living fully in time, from accepting time as it is, rather than trying to capture and control it. This is where we can rest now. In this understanding, in this quiet recognition of how it was, how it could be, how it still is beneath all our measuring and managing. Time passes. It always has. It always will. And we pass through it, briefly, beautifully, each of us living our moments however we can, whether we count them or not. Good night.